Okay, that's a minute past the hour, so I think we will kick off. Um, and there might be a few people still joining us, but let's get started. So, um, good afternoon or good morning, whatever you happen to be. Welcome to this latest FarrPoint webinar. Very pleased to have you all join us today. We're going to spend the next hour looking at developments in the satellite industry. It's an area of which is seeing lots of investment and technical breakthroughs, so a very happening kind of sector. We've got a great panel with us today to chat through the topic. Um, but before I introduce them, I'll just do some quick housekeeping. Um, this session is going to be recorded, so that's for those who can't attend, and for all of you who can view again at a later date. Um, please keep your camera off and your speaker on mute. Use the chat function for any Q&A you might have. We'll keep a lookout on that as the session progresses, and save a little time at the end just to pick up on them. Um, and just a top tip, once we get rid of these slides, if you use the gallery mode, I think you can probably see the panel a bit easier. Our panel today, I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a minute, but just as a just as a quick intro from me, so I'm the moderator. I'm the chief exec of FarrPoint. So we've got a team who cover off the commercialization and investment angle around the satellite industry. We've got the UK Space Agency and industry leaders in Canada and from within FarrPoint. So a really good panel. I'm going to stop sharing and start turning to the panel and let them introduce themselves. So I'll come around to each of you, just give a quick introduction of who you are, your organization, and your interest in the sector. Andy, could I come to you first?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So, Andy Gray, CEO of Exotopic. My background is in satellite engineering, but I've worked in every segment of space, and I founded Exotopic 6 years ago, which is does a lot of work at the moment with investors and with businesses who are looking to develop new technologies and services for particularly the space sector.
Good stuff. Henny.
Thanks. I'm Henny Sands, Head of Telecoms here at the UK Space Agency. I'm actually a civil servant by background, but I've been in post in in the telecoms team for about 8 years. In that time, I've probably assessed hundreds of bids worth billions of pounds of investment. I'm now the head of the program, and my role is, and that of my team, is to support the sector to grow the economy, but also to deliver key capabilities for the SATCOM sector. Do that through three different programs at the moment. The ESA Artes program, and I'm here at ESA HQ today. We cover everything from 5G and 6G take up through to optical technologies. I also cover the connectivity in low Earth orbit, which is a government program to shape the sector by providing very high value awards for key capability companies delivering particular technologies to global operators. And the final part of what I do is on the Satellite Gateway Services program, which is a new program supporting the gateway part of the space sector in the UK.
Excellent. Thanks, Henny. Jason.
Sure. Jason Pressman. Coming to you from just outside the Greater Toronto area in Ontario, Canada. I'm an independent advisor and strategist, and just a long history in the Canadian telco sector, broadband sector, and been working with companies, I would say, over the last probably year to 2 years, figuring out how to treat space-based communications not as the option of last resort, and figure out how do they work that into their businesses, innovate with new services, move forward, and figure out how they effectively differentiate and compete in specific markets. I also have a newsletter that I publish weekly and a podcast that's been kicking up as well that specifically focuses on broadband telco space and AI. So that's sort of been my platform for things at the same time.
Yeah, highly recommend a newsletter.
Thank you.
Emma.
Thanks, Andrew. Emma Philpott. I'm a principal consultant at FarrPoint. I've been at FarrPoint for nearly 6 years now, and I head up our space practice. I've been in the telecoms industry for about 18 years now. My background is predominantly in wireless, rolling out various networks over the years, but now very much involved in at FarrPoint, doing a lot of work with different government agencies, local government, looking at different connectivity options, different use cases, and where potentially satellite can address some of those needs. So yeah, that's me.
Good stuff. Thanks to everybody. Hopefully people can hear us. I know there was a couple of messages about no sound, but hopefully that's just local glitches. So let me pose the first question to you all. I'd like you to share with us the areas that you're most excited about in this sector. And as I was thinking about, excited, but also maybe concerned. There's a lot going on. So if you could just give me a flavor of the things that are really kind of intriguing you and you're keeping an eye on and you expect to see coming along and we're all going to be interested in the future. Andy, come to you first.
Yeah, great. So, I do a lot of work in space and quite broadly across different segments of space. And I think it just seems to be a hugely disruptive time at the moment in particular. So, I've been working in the industry for sort of nearly 20 years and now in particular seems to be quite a lot of change and excitement and interest from new players into the space market. So, I'm in Uruguay right now at the British Embassy, where we're working with people here, the government here, to look at how they can get involved in space, and they want to potentially develop a spaceport, and also look at how they can be part of the space supply chain because they see its increased importance. I was in Cyprus last week at a teleport, speaking to the operator there, who was saying all of our geo customers, because we mainly focus on geostationary satellite communications systems and operators, they're struggling, and we're seeing the impact of that. We've been working with Airbus in the UK, and we're seeing the changes that they're having to make to their organizational structure, all because of I would say a kind of combination of the changing costs and access to space, the ability of new players to come in, obviously some individuals who have disrupted the market. Elon Musk obviously had to come up quite early on in this conversation. And yeah, I think that whilst we work a lot with investors, and whilst I think the traditional space industry may look at it and say, oh, this is is this bad things because we're seeing people lose jobs from certain businesses, etc. We're seeing challenge from new rivals, new competitors. But actually, investors are very much interested where there is disruption and where there is opportunity, and where there are those companies that can come in and start to deliver new space services. And I think that that's kind of the really exciting time is these changes in launch costs, in access to space, new players, new types of systems, low Earth orbit systems. That means we've got this kind of we're starting to see satellite not just compete within its own market, its own section of the market. So historically it's had a relatively narrow piece of the pie in telecoms. We're now starting to see it eat into the rest of the telecoms pie and the terrestrial operators, and starting to see terrestrial operators respond. So I think that combination just means that at this moment we don't know exactly how things will play out, but it's certainly a time of opportunity to do new things.
Cool, cool. Jason, what about you?
Sure. I mean, I'll frame my comment around just some background. So I lived through the birth of 10 base T Ethernet, right? When it was
Mhm.
standardized, and 10 meg and 10 gig and 100 gig, and I've said this to people before, that it's got this feel of sort of the early to mid 2000s level of disruption we saw in the telco space, right? Where things are just happening so fast, and there's so many different things happening at a pace with which proprietary solutions are being put in place, and then all of a sudden everything converges on standards at some point. So I think there's a lot of that ultimately that will happen. But if you look at the stuff that I look at, and just from just being engaged in the sector, I think what's happening in the space-based data center section or region, I think is quite interesting in terms of people thinking that the majority of the of data processing should be done in space because of the power requirements, because of a lot of the other aspects around cooling and whatnot that come into place. But around that, there's things like, obviously, reusable launch is interesting. But as you're focusing on data and as you're moving things around, I think there's a focus on security that I don't know that I see a lot around in terms of data security. I think there's aspects of that are coming out, but I think there's an issue specifically around security, both physical security with bad actors in space, right? Trying to pull each other's stuff out of orbit, literally pull each other's stuff out of orbit, as opposed to data security and cybersecurity. So that's an aspect. Some of the other stuff I think, which is actually kind of interesting, when you look at the LEO space, you've got the OneWebs, the Telesats, and then you've got the guys like Rivada who are talking about the whole gatewayless architecture, just point to point, pure sovereign data, secure data, where you've just got fiber in the sky, as it were. So that sort of thing is quite interesting. And then from the pure, from the Canadian focus, and Andy, you talked about launch capacity and whatnot. Spaceport Canada, right? Being able to build that launch capacity in Canada, and then companies like Nord Space working on hypersonic type of things as well in the military. So there's so many aspects of it. But from the communication side, for me, I think it's the opportunity around IoT. And
Mhm.
we can talk about that later, but really where that's
Mhm.
driving all the standardization of everything, certainly what's happening with the different aspects around data communication specifically, or broadband communication specifically, and then again, I think that uh, just the overall focus on getting more up there faster, and being able to converge with terrestrial based services. That's the other piece that is coming hard and fast as well. And how do people harness that? And how do you take
Mhm.
advantage of that as well? So a number of aspects there. It's a lot of exciting things going on.
Yeah, yeah, good. No, the IoT piece we'll come on to when we talk
Yep.
about in relation maybe just the direct to sell stuff that we'll talk about later. Emma, you're kind of fresh from the recent conference in Washington, where there's a
Yeah,
lot going on.
yeah, there was a lot, and I think a lot of it is Andy and Jason have touched on. I mean, for me, it's definitely, I think, around the disruption around launch services in the commercial market. I mean, I think over the past, I mean, the main driver, I think, of the launch market is to support the large constellation of small satellites that are looking to go up, not just from the broadband side of things, from obviously Starlink, but you've got a big increase in remote sensing satellites, large communication systems, future payloads for defense systems. So I think as Andy said, Elon Musk, SpaceX, the Falcon 9, I think that's our most experienced launch vehicle now. Last year, I think it did 134 launches with the Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy as well. I think this year they've got 170 launches planned. I think it's exciting looking at the developments around the Starship that they've got. Certainly the capacity of that rocket and the ability to launch potentially whole constellations with one launch or two launches. I think, but that's going to, again, that continues to drive down that cost of the cost of launch. I think you're looking at Falcon Heavy at being $1,400 per kilogram. I think with Starship and other rockets, we've got obviously New Glenn had their first successful launch earlier this year. That potentially, you're looking at, they're talking around launch costs now per kilogram of $200, $300 to $600. And I think with the rideshare schemes that all these companies have, that's beneficial to everyone in the space economy that's looking to get payload whether or not that's for broadband, whether or not that's for some of the other new innovative companies that are, that are starting off, like Space Forge over in the UK. So I think, for me, I think it's the exciting thing is around that reuse and that launch cadence technology that's continued to be developed. I think that will be important to get rid of some of this backlog that we've got across, the likes of NASA, Kuiper, AEST, Space Mobile. And then I suppose the other area for me is around Amazon's Kuiper. I think that was a big discussion, over in DC. Obviously, people keen to see that. When's it going to come online? When a commercial service is going to be available? I mean, there was no dates as such, but I know ULA have got all their launches pretty much this year are booked up with the Kuiper satellites, and I know they're looking to get around Amazon looking to get about half in orbit by mid next year. I think that's going to really, again, for end users. So, because obviously Kuiper is going to have a similar business model to Starlink, so direct to end users. I think that'll be interesting to, we can hopefully start to see maybe prices come down as well in sort of providing, some of the broadband costs. So that'll be, and then the other, they're not we've got things like Telesat Lightspeed as well, that again, different business model. They're going to be more like the OneWeb, B2B, but again, looking to come online. So interesting times.
Good stuff. I'll move on to Henny, and maybe Emma, you could try and reset your Zoom or something like that, because your sync is a little bit out between video and speech. But we'll move on to Henny while you're trying to sort that out. Hi, Henny. Your top areas.
Yeah. So for me, there's three things happening in the world at the moment that are really genuinely exciting. First one is non-terrestrial convergence with terrestrial comms, and on the face of it, it's a really interesting development and it's disruptive, but behind it is a big change in how the sector sees its value. And I remember when I first started in the sector, there was a sense that they were different things and they didn't really operate together. And actually what's happened is the space sector can now provide a very small slice of the terrestrial comms infrastructure, but it's an absolutely critical slice. So there's a real understanding across the board what the value of the space sector is and how space can close those final miles, those final very few percentages of coverage and deliver ubiquity. And I know the word ubiquity is almost ubiquitous itself, but it's a really important concept for what's coming next. And then the second part is direct to device. So once you've got that ubiquity, then you can connect anyone, anywhere on the planet using Android or Apple phones. So in 5 years' time, it's not hard to conceive of a world where everyone can connect somehow to mobile and voice, text and voice services. And increasingly at that point, I think we'll start seeing data services come online as well. And from where we sit at the space agency and within government, that's a huge opportunity to end the digital divide. And it'll take some new form, I'm sure. But in the immediate term, that's, hundreds of millions of people, billions of people connected to text and voice services. In a few years' time, text, voice, and data services. And it will literally transform how we live, work, and travel on our planet. And it's, it's a fundamental shift in the human experience as well. So for me, D2D is really, really important. A big part of D2D that we forget a lot is IoT. A device is a mobile phone or a tracker or a sensor. And so there's so much opportunity in what we can do in terms of monitoring remotely on the planet's surface. And I did have a different third one, but listening to the others talk, it's reminded me that actually the big thing, and it's been a big thing for about the last 10 years, and it keeps growing, is access to space. And that's not in terms of resilience, that's in terms of cost per kilogram of getting your hardware into space. Having so much easy access to space has been behind the boom in multiple operators, new kinds of operators, new kinds of micro businesses operating global services. And so that transformation is key. And then the flip side of that, the challenge for that, is it's such a period of transformation, and it only keeps getting faster. The outlook is that it's going to get even faster. So a big part of my role is, and I don't claim any special knowledge to do this, but I do have a role in funding, is helping companies navigate that disruption to see the opportunities and exploit those opportunities for the UK for economic growth as well.
Okay, good, thanks. Just if we could home in on Leo specifically, and the end user markets. I mean, I think you all touched on that in your responses there, but we all know of Leo as being for broadband use and so on, and there are other sectors too that will be involved with. But could you give us a sense of where these other sectors are, where the revenue is coming from? I guess a lot is in defence, but what are the other sectors that are important to consider for Leo? Anybody want to pick up that one up to start with?
I don't mind. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, you just kind of, if you look at the market as well as how, it's not just the LEO, it's the way that the traditional satellite operators, so some of the geostationary players have paired up as well with some of the LEO providers. So you've got SES with Intelsat, you've got Viasat with Inmarsat now. And I think, they do all have different models. Some are going direct for like B2B, like the OneWeb, Telesalat. But I think all of them, the main verticals, I think are really around that, outside of, if you like, the end user broadband would be the maritime, the aviation, and then touched on, Andrew, like the government defence. I think maritime is a huge industry at the moment. I think Starlink, they did 75,000 installations on different ships last year. I think cruise liners are, they've announced partnerships with major cruise liners, as have OneWeb. I think SES have recently come out and said, I think their cruise line industry, combined with their government industry, their customers, they've taken most of their satellite capacity, which is why they're launching their O3B mPOWER satellites that are going up. I think they've got three, they've got another 6 going up this year. I think that's going to give them an extra 30% capacity across their constellation, and that is really to serve the maritime industry.
Okay.
So I think,
okay,
yeah.
So, Andy, from what you're seeing in terms of the investments and startups and so on, and where are you seeing these end user sectors?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's broadly a demand now and a requirement, right, for everybody, everything potentially. You mentioned IoT, to be connected in some way all the time, and really, you can only do that from space. And then the requirements around those connections are increasing as well. So also you can only do it from space, but you need a combination of solutions and technologies and orbits, as Emma alluded to, not necessarily just LEO, and also not necessarily just one LEO constellation. Multi constellation terminals, I think, will be important to enable people to be connected all the time according to the requirements of what they want to do. So obviously we're seeing huge amounts of finance going into projects like Starlink and like Kuiper, but I think we're also seeing the guys in Barcelona who I met the other day, the satellite. Satellite.
How do you pronounce their name? Yeah.
Yeah. So they just raised like 70 million euros, I think, right?
Yeah.
To provide a service which is very specific, right? Like low data rate service, making sure that everything's connected all the time. So you've got these different markets, and each of those has maybe slightly different requirements or different applications with different requirements, but they all need to be served by space. Really, there's not really an obvious solution beyond that. Obviously, when you go into the B2C market, it's a little bit different. It's more the failings of the terrestrial market, I would say, that introduce the opportunities for satellite B2C, other than very specific areas where it's just not feasible for terrestrial to go there. So yeah, I think it's kind of an all markets thing, and I think that's the attraction to investors is there's a huge market that can be accessed, all different types of applications, all different sort of opportunities within the space value chain.
And I suppose with the cost per kilo reduction, as you're saying, and the launch facilities improving and so on, it allows more the opportunity for more organizations and ideas and potential new services to come along because of that barriers being reduced a bit.
It's also a risk as well, though, right? Because who owns the launch services and who's providing those launch services? And look at what's happened in terms of the risk of potentially being on Starlink and not being considered the right customer at that time, right? They might switch it off. What if it's an interesting one, right? Because SpaceX entered their customers market in comms, and the satellite industry kind of sat there and allowed them to do that, right? They were giving money for launches to launch their own things, and there's a risk, right, that for these other companies coming through, whilst there is an opportunity provided by the low launch costs, there's also a risk if you are reliant on a launch provider who is also a competitor in your market. So I think it'll be not just the development of SpaceX's capabilities, the development of capabilities internationally by different nations will be really important to make sure that access is not just affordable, but continues to be open and accessible for everybody.
Mm-hmm. How do you see that in Canada, Jason?
Well, I mean, I think some of the applications, if I go back to some of the stuff Emma was talking about, some of the end user applications, there's a lot of focus with forest fires and whatnot, and the devastation around that, around applications around fire monitoring, avalanche detection, those sort of applications. So not specifically to specific markets around consumer or business, but actual real detection and real applications of monitoring and preventing lives and preventing loss of life rather along that side. If you look at companies like Kepler as well, where they're doing data relay in space, right? A separate application where they're providing what typically would be terrestrial transport, but they're doing it in space for satellite-based providers to move data around in space. So you've got that level of functionality that's coming up as well. But certainly, going back to what Andy was saying about just providing services where it's needed, we still have a problem with the unserved and the underserved. And the cost of terrestrial infrastructure and the cost per gigabit of services and whatnot, and sometimes it is the only solution for some of these communities to be able to get people connected. So there's a number of aspects of it that are still absolutely required or in play. But I think there's lots of other things going on right around Earth observability, and again, as I mentioned, detection and alert or advanced alert with all sorts of catastrophic events. I think that people can take advantage of. And just back to the thing about the satellite, their satellite IoT, however you pronounce their name. What's interesting to them, or what's interesting about them, is that from a narrowband IoT perspective, I think they're looking at doing something that's just standards based and allowing you to take existing devices that are narrowband IoT enabled and just use it in space, as opposed to having to rely on infrastructure on the ground to support it. So I think those sort of things as well will help with proliferation rather of detection and all sorts of smart services in that regard.
Okay, thanks. Coming to the topic which you raised, Henny, around direct-to-device. So certainly an area that's getting a lot of interest. If I made, keen to open it up and chat about that. So if I made the statement that the advent of direct-to-device means that governments no longer need to be concerned about improving rural coverage. We've got it through direct-to-device. So how would you respond to that?
I would say that's not true. I think there's a lot of false expectation. The key thing is Right now, you can send a text message. In 5 years' time, you'll be able to send your own text messages, and you'll be able to have voice calls. And then in around 10 years' time, you'll be looking at the first data services. So that timeline, the first 5 years of that timeline is fairly clear. The 10-year point at which you can get data, that still has to be solved. That's a problem to be solved at scale. How you deliver all of that through all of the terrestrial spectrum, all of the different spectrum bands that are already in use, and how you do it without interfering with your neighbor's spectrum. Spectrum is going to become so important in how we access and use D2D services for the future. And it's going to be really very complex delivery structure to do it. So I think it's important, while we talk about the future ambition of direct-to-device, it's important to root it in the facts, which are, it's going to take some time. There's going to be some winners and losers. I think IoT is easier. So narrowband services, what they offer are a form of resilience that we haven't really seen before, where people's homes, people's businesses could have dozens of direct to satellite connections. So Jason's absolutely right. You don't have a sort of IoT backhaul function anymore. Your devices connect directly to satellite. So that is an instant game changer. And there's other companies out there as well that we support in the UK who do that. So I think it's really key that we're realistic about direct to device. And I think there's almost an order of rollout to it. So when you think about maritime, there's an awful lot of very small boats that can't afford maritime terminals, and they use phones within the shore distance. And so direct to device will have a huge impact on their ability to stay in contact with people on the land. And really that's how we'll start to see its impact, through lots of small incremental changes that are going to have on those particular markets quite significant impacts. So taken together, it's small and incremental, but each of those changes will be quite major for everyone concerned.
Yeah, I think I think to some degree it depends on your classification of rural, right? I don't know what the technical definition is and when urban becomes rural and vice versa, but for the kind of extreme rural cases, then yeah, probably I'd be thinking, satellite provides that solution. It can provide the sort of safety and security for people as they move beyond existing terrestrial networks. I'm thinking more for things where people are, out in the very rural, hiking across the moors or whatever, and like you say, in the kind of maritime environment for people who don't have the sort of need necessarily for like a VSAT type service, because they're supporting relatively smaller numbers. And I imagine you'll probably use it as needed, and it won't be your primary source of communication throughout your kind of daily life. I think still you need to be looking at terrestrial infrastructure to support satellite communications for sort of semi-rural and places where you have sort of multiple people, families like residing in fairly small areas, because it's going to be expensive otherwise, I imagine, to provide that service. I think we're already seeing with SpaceX's services that they're starting to apply like congestion charges and things like that, and you pay more when you're in a more congested area. So I think to keep it affordable, to keep it accessible, we should always be taking any opportunities we have to expand out terrestrial networks. But probably you can start to think more about your business case for providing those kind of very rural locations and think, actually, maybe I can rely on satellite services now.
Okay. Emma, what did you hear about that topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We talk about rural, I think, in different aspects here. I think if we're looking at, a D2D service for, rural areas across sub-Saharan Africa, it very much, it's less about the intricacies of the technology and using different spectrum bands and integrating non-terrestrial with terrestrial. It's affordability of the handset, and you know, honestly, $1,000 for a smartphone it is out of the limits of a lot of people around the globe, really. So although D2D has that potential, there are other factors that come into play, really, when you start thinking about, as Henny said, that ubiquitous coverage. There's a lot of other things that have to be addressed. Listen, I think it's a great opportunity. I think there's different business models. I think we've got SpaceX, AST, Space Mobile, Link. They're all going after the you know, using the spectrum bands of existing of the MNOs. I think then you've got the Iridium and the Global Star who are looking at reutilizing their existing satellite spectrum bands, which is what the, you know, Global Star is doing with Apple. I think both have, you know, I agree with Henny. I don't think this is a big bang. I think there's a lot of hype around D2D that I think actually, you know, as an industry, we seem to fall into this trap a lot. We did it with the 5G use cases, you know, of all the things that 5G was going to be doing, and then, you know, the industry rolled out 5G non-standard, and you know, I think MNOs have got to, if they're looking at this as well with satellite operators, it's managing that customer expectation. You know, although D2D has now been incorporated into the 3GPP standards, it's in release 17. It will be further refined in 18 and 19. It will never be 5G. It's not going to be, you know, it's not going to have that capability at best. It will be the voice capability that you have maybe with 3G and stuff. So it's still out in terms of, is it going to be profitable for the satellite operators long term? I think Andy's touched on it. You know, at the end of the day, we're looking to this technology to fill in, if you like, the gaps in cellular coverage and fixed broadband coverage potentially. But you know, if you fit, you know, if those gaps, then if an alternative technology comes along that's cheaper, that could be fixed wireless access. That could be, you know, there's a lot of governments around the world still rolling out, you know, subsidized gigabit programs, and mobile programs for infill. Then the second an alternative technology moves in, your business plan is not as profitable. So I think it's not got to just be profitable; it's got to be sustainable. And I think you know, it's going to work D2D in certain environments where you know, there's efficiencies about using it to provide services, maybe to edge networks and edge customers, that it's just outside that line of profitability of using a terrestrial network. But I think there's a lot of technical issues we need to get over around, you know, as Henny touched on it, the regulatory requirements around, you know, these satellites. If you're using them as base stations, they move. Traditional base stations don't; they're static. You might have to do your radio plan again if you get a notice to quit, but with low Earth orbit, they're constantly moving. They will be going very quickly from one country. You know, their beams will go very quickly from one country to the next, where there may be different power regulations about using mobile spectrum band and capability. And so it might, you know, I think where this will probably lend itself are areas like, I'm sure Jason will jump in, but like Canada, the US, Australia, countries that have got a lot of landmass that is still not all connected by terrestrial, but there's also quite a bit of, you know, people do buy smartphones. They've got that as well, so that, you know, they have that capability. But I think across Europe it will be quite complex, just because we're a lot of countries all quite close together, all with very different regulatory requirements when it comes to using the mobile spectrum bands, that is. And if you're using satellite bands for D2D, then it's always going to be limited with capacity. So it will never, you know, it certainly won't ever be the data and things like that people talk about. So yeah, for me, I think it's managing that risk around this expectation about what is it. I fully agree with Henny and others. I think the IoT market is really where this lends itself to.
I think just jumping in on the D2D thing, I mean, I think just long term, I don't imagine that you will sign a contract as a consumer with a D2D services company. I think you still have your contract with an MNO, and that the D2D service will be part of the MNO's service offering. You know, it would just be integrated, and that it will be strategic from the MNOs. And you know, I think we see that now in terms of the operators investing in these networks and building partnerships.
I think yeah, no, some of it is you sit back with a big bucket of popcorn and watch the show, right? In terms of everybody going forward with their deployments and their developments and the trials. I mean, I think everybody's seen announcements of so and so created, did a voice call, and somebody else did they did an initial video call, and I keep hearing about everybody saying that, hey, I can just pick up any phone and initially want to use it on the network or make calls, but then I read other things that say it's only Samsung phones with the Snapdragon chipsets that are working properly. And Emma, back to your point, there's proprietary, there's stuff that's more 3GPP release 17 based. There's back to the IoT stuff. What is it, 3GPP NTN versus the 5G NB IoTs? Like there's so much of this going on back and forth. But at the end of the day, the problem to solve for some of this stuff is really around the ubiquitous coverage. And I think, Andrew, you might have been at the same show I was at when we heard from people in some really northern, rural, and remote regions of Canada that were talking about people who had died because they had no access to 911 services, or they had no ability to call somebody and get help. So absolutely, there's a definite requirement for it and a definite need for it. And from the Canadian side of things, I think it was back in 2023 when Link Global talked about doing some stuff, or did a demo with Rogers. SpaceX talked about an agreement with Rogers as well for SMS. And then in 2025, just in February, ISED finally came out with, I'm just reading it, the decision on a policy licensing and technical framework for supplemental mobile coverage by satellite, which is really the regulatory framework that targets the underserved and unserved community. And I think that's one of the first places in the world that's actually come out with that level of a regulatory framework to support it and to allow it to move forward. So I think you need to have that sort of regulatory environment in place to make sure that you've got services that are that are serving what the need is, as opposed to just buckshot sort of approaches to things. But it is really interesting to just to watch what's going on, and again, the pace with which this stuff is developing, and the innovation that's going around it as well. So lots of things going on in that space for sure, and tons of opportunities, even in the back to the IoT space, just that direct to device IoT space as well. And I think there's some good first mover advantages there for the folks who can harness what's out there already. Back to those satellite IoT guys, harness what's already in there without having to put something proprietary in to then capture it and give it a larger feel and scope.
Okay, thanks, Jason. I'm seeing some interesting conversations about apps in the chat. I'd love to do a apps project, but I don't know if I ever will. Good. Can I just move on to another question then? This is the last one before we move to some Q&A. Thinking about the role of satellite in amongst other connectivity technologies, and we touched on this in the introduction. I think it was you, Henny. If I'm running an organization which needs to connect dispersed sites over a geography, what role should satellite play now in amongst all the other technologies I could choose from for connecting up my sites, compared to in the past where there's maybe a bit of geo used for some backhaul or some specific application somewhere. But in terms of the toolbox of things, I'm looking at the satellite got more of a role now, and what would that be? Maybe come to you, Henny, since I think you mentioned it at the start.
Yeah, I think again, I think we sometimes put a lot of expectation on satellite because we hear about it so much in the news. But the reality is that geo satellites are still doing the heavy lifting on data. There's still so many use cases where you don't need low latency. So geo satellite can provide a lot of capability. And being able to switch between the two is in a lot of different companies' business plans, which is why we've seen acquisitions of low Earth orbit companies by some of the traditional geo operators as well. I think the key thing is accessing those services. So if you have the terminals that can access them, and someone mentioned a generic terminal, which is really what everyone's after, so that you can move operator, you can move service when you need it. I think excuse me, I think that's probably the key to delivering future services.
Okay.
Yeah, I think just picking up a little bit. Sorry, I think I think people are mainly going to be
How are you?
driven by price, right? I think, and at the end of the day, it's what's the lowest price I can pay for the service that I need. And if I'm you mentioned like a site, so if I'm a business operating a certain site, then potentially what I need isn't a low latency service. Maybe it's something that will be served by Geo. Maybe if a roaming fleet, then I want a faster Leo type service. It's very much, I think, will be not it's not one answer, right? You will select the service that meets your needs, and the more as I think everyone's raised on this so far, more integrated that service offering is, and the ease at which you can have a sort of single supplier for that service, and the kind of easy kind of cost model for accessing that service. I think kind of the better for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Jason, you've been involved in various designs, network designs, and solutions over the years. But how do you see satellite taking more of a role potentially?
Yeah, I think it's, again, not the option of last resort. I think there's a number of examples now and things that are coming out as Telesat launches Lightspeed, and some other services come out. Back to Andy's point about integrating it into the infrastructure through, MEF3 compliance, everything else, MPLS-based services. It just becomes another connection for the right application, meaning that if I'm sending traffic out of my network and something is sovereign and secure and has to go from Toronto to Dubai, I want to send it over that link that's going to get it there with that application specific functionality. If it's something that's a least cost route or something that is a backup connection, then maybe I'm going to go over a satellite connection. So it's not a one size fits all. And this is where you're starting to see these multi-orbit, multi-connectivity type of solutions coming to play, where you've got LTE and you've got 5G and you've got geo-based stuff, you've got LEO-based connections, you've got different focuses or different sort of constellations that are in place supporting them. And another example is, I think, or another piece that will drive it is obviously the cost of the service. Back to Andy's point about, if it becomes something that's viable, why not use satellite-based connectivity in a traditional telecom network to back up pop sites, or to add in that capacity when you need it, when there is disaster recovery required, right? So have the capacity standing by, turn it on when you need it, and have it instantly available, as opposed to not having something or having to pull something else in. So, there's a lot of people who have these SD-WAN type solutions that have bonding solutions, but it really is, I think, becoming, look, at the end of the day, if the data gets to where it's supposed to be and it's secure and the cost profile's there, do you care what it is, right? Do you care if it's terrestrial or non-terrestrial? Mm-hmm. If it's easily integrated into what you're doing, if you can manage it and if you can control it the way you need to, then absolutely it becomes just another option, or another tool in the toolkit, if you will. And I think we're starting to see more of that, or we're going to see more of that over time, as long as the cost profiles are sufficient. And as long as the technology is there. I mean, I think Starlink is talking about their SLA-based type services now as well. They started to appear at certain points in Canada that are public, and I think you're going to see more of that. So it's, all things being equal, if I can treat satellite as another just extension of my network, and it's transparent from a network connectivity point of view, why not? Right? Why not use it as an option?
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a couple of questions which I want to bring in from the chat, and I'm going to give this one to you, Henny, to start off with. It maybe kind of builds on what we're talking about. Given the pace of change, how should those developing policy to close the urban, rural, and remote digital divides think about the role of satellite? Should they be in a holding pattern?
No, not at all. So Ofcom, I think earlier this week, announced a D2D consultation. Mm-hmm. And it's absolutely right to be anticipating what models look like, how they'll be governed, how they'll be managed by all of the different stakeholders involved. These are really complex models. And I think, optical technology is a really good example, where everyone said, oh, there's no regulation in optical. It's great. We can build whatever we want. And for years, no one built anything because no one wanted to hedge their bets on building one thing when it would be another. And then the moment when the SDA transport layer was announced, that was the go-to for optical technology. And suddenly you saw a huge investment across the board into really defined optical technology that people could invest in the long term in. So for me, that's a really good example where it's fine to say, oh, if there's no regulation, we should enjoy it. But the reality is that that's no way to run a business, no way to run a regulatory regime. You need to deliver something that works the best way possible. So no, not holding regime. We should be very, very active to create the regulatory environment we actually want. And that means lots of different things to lots of different people. But having a conversation about what it looks like in the first place is a great way to start.
Yeah, and I think just quickly, like I think regulation isn't necessarily all stick, right? So I just listened to a presentation from Saxaford Spaceport, and they had to build a lot of the spaceport without regulation being in place, and that was a challenge because they didn't know how things were going to change, etc. So I think, I think regulation can also be a tool to support people who are looking to roll out the services as well.
Another question from the chat. I'll maybe direct this to you first, Jason. How will consumer home internet service performance fare as higher margin services attract LEO capacity?
I'm not sure I understand the question fully.
So
where's the
as LEO, it's from Ian Hobbs. So as there are more and more services using the LEO capacity, and maybe some have got a higher margin, how will that impact home internet services? So will they be squeezed by higher margin services?
Yeah, I think that, I think you're going to see, there's going to be more competition in that space for sure, especially when guys like Kuiper get out there, right? And I think their plan, I think they've been fairly public about it, is to come out with something that is much lower cost and have a lower cost service that comes to market. And how they leverage that whole prime infrastructure that they have will be very interesting and exciting to watch, actually, to see what happens there. I'm struggling with an answer to the question because I don't know that it's
that is something necessarily will happen. Yeah.
I think it's always, I was going to say, with satellite, with the low, I think it'll always be a capacity issue. As fast as it seems to go up, that capacity is used, whether or not that's for home broadband and end users, or whether it's different vertical segments like maritime, aviation, etc., sucking up that capacity. But there is a lot planned for launch, especially with Kuiper and Lightspeed. But will that be sufficient? I think even Starlink want more. I think they got close to 7,000 satellites at the moment. I think their original plan was it was great. You're talking 30, 40,000 at one point. Whether or not they'll ever get there, I don't know. But I think it's always that balance, because when you've got those the bigger players, if you like, in those other verticals like the maritime, the aviation, and some of those big contracts, the likes of Starlink and OneWeb and others have signed up to, then obviously they're hugely profitable for those satcom operators. It's and I think that's probably one of the reasons we've seen Starlink, and we may see it when Kuiper's launched and commercial services, is they do put restrictions now on they are more stringent with their using data, etc., and not going over the limits.
I think we're not in the real market right now, right? So it's not settled out yet. The prices that we see now are not reflective of the actual business models, and I think that's what needs to play out. And what we'll see, is obviously if your demand outstrips supply, then your prices will be higher and will go higher. If, like we're seeing with the geos now at the moment, their supply far outstrips demand, their prices are going through the floor. So it still needs to balance itself out, I think, and as the amount of supply changes and also as the demand shifts.
Yeah, I think as well the other part of it isn't necessarily margin but disruption. So what does disruption mean in that sense? It's delivering a product that disrupts the market but delivers a much more bespoke product to your customers, so you can capture a bigger share of the customer base. And that's what we're starting to see with lots of quite innovative satellite services coming on board, where they're layering satellite services on a SATCOM backbone to deliver a whole different kind of service to a customer. And it's that kind of disruption that's going to see the market change so much over the coming years, I think, rather than purely margin.
I think that's one of the things that you look at, with multi-orbit. It's those partnerships that have been announced with the different operators partnering up with some of the LEOs. It's that, okay, where where can they use the GEO over areas where they do need to increase capacity quickly, in addition to the LEO, which are things maybe like ports, for example, as an example, when cruise ships come in, etc. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've got kind of like the separation of LEO and GEO, and you say, like I said, GEO prices going through the floor and LEO prices increasing. Actually, if it's a combined service and you're just being seamlessly handed off onto a GEO because that's all you need right then you pay one price and it's one price in the market. And the idea of the operators will be to distribute that demand as best as possible according to their supply.
Okay. So just, I mean, we're about to wrap up, but would you say that it's just good news what's going on in the satellite market? It's good news for consumers. It's good news for government and policymakers, and some things to work out. But we're getting more innovation. We're getting more capacity, which will make things more competitive. Is that just a real good picture that we should all be behind, or are there some cautionary elements to this?
I think it's generally good news. It's always good to be, there's a little bit of caution there. I think, when you go back to where we started talking about launch, I think whilst demand is very high at the moment for launch services, and there's a lot out there, Rocket Lab and Blue Origin and SpaceX, obviously, I think these are all launching over the next couple of years, big constellations, that eventually that demand will ebb slowly. I think there's always going to be a replenishment of satellites, particularly low Earth orbit. That's just by the nature of their design every 4 or 5 years. But so I think that's something to kind of watch. But I suppose for me, I think it's all good news, apart from the fact that the satellite industry, we can't escape the fact it is a global industry, going end to end, all the manufacturing, etc. It's normally done across multiple countries. Same with launch facilities, and there's a lot of talk around tariffs at the moment, to be topical. That could have that has the potential to very disruptive to the satellite industry across multiple layers, and potentially all this good news around costs going down, both to end users potentially, and also launch costs. So for smaller micro companies wanting to get satellites in space, I think that could potentially be disruptive.
I think it's bad news if you're a regulator, because you probably need to cancel your holidays. I mean, I think we've not even discussed like space debris and the impacts of these constellations, and all of the challenges that the market's going to face in the next few years. So I think you're going to be very busy.
A busy time for a regulator attendees.
And as we've seen with every other market, as we've seen with every other market, right? And I'll talk in the broadband space, as you see more competitors come online, there's always this natural sort of competitive race to zero, unfortunately, and for some side of it. But I think that Kuiper is really going to exert a lot of pressure on Starlink, and you're going to see the whole pricing methodology, the whole pricing models change in terms of the subscription models and whatnot. It's going to be interesting to see what they do to the market.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. On that note, we're going to wrap it up. It's an hour already. So thank you very much to the panelists for a great discussion. I'm sure there's a lot more to follow up on. Thanks to everybody who joined online. As I said at the start, there will be a recording made available, which we will get out to you later when it's ready. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, all.